The morning of February 19, 1945, dawned cold and gray over the volcanic island of Iwo Jima. The air tasted of sulfur and salt, and the black sand beaches stretched like a wound across the Pacific horizon. In a makeshift holding area behind the American lines, 37 Japanese soldiers sat in absolute silence, their backs rigid, their eyes fixed on nothing. They did not speak. They did not move. They barely breathed. Each man had been taught since childhood that capture meant dishonor worse than death, that surrender was the unforgivable sin, and that the Americans, those barbaric demons from across the sea, would subject them to tortures unimaginable. So they sat, waiting for the inevitable, their hands trembling not from cold but from the certainty of what was to come. They had been soldiers of the Emperor, warriors of the rising sun, men who had sworn to die rather than accept the shame of captivity. 4 years, their commanders had filled their minds with stories of American savagery. Tales of prisoners tortured, mutilated, paraded through streets as trophies of conquest. They had been shown propaganda films depicting Allied soldiers as monsters without honor or mercy. They had read leaflets describing the fate that awaited those who surrendered. And so, when the flamethrowers had finally forced them from their caves, when ammunition had run dry and retreat had become impossible, they had emerged expecting execution. Instead, they found themselves here, in this wire-enclosed pen, guarded by young Marines who offered them water and bandaged their wounds. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Nothing in their indoctrination had prepared them for this moment. Nothing had prepared them for kindness from the enemy. One prisoner, a 23-year-old corporal named Takeshi Yamamoto, would later write in his diary that the first American he encountered handed him a canteen without speaking, without hatred in his eyes, without any visible desire for revenge. Yamamoto had been trained to fight to the death on Iwo Jima's volcanic slopes. He had watched friends torn apart by naval bombardment. He had survived on rainwater and raw fish for 11 days in a cave system beneath Mount Suribachi. When he finally surrendered, delirious from dehydration and infection, he had expected a bullet. Instead, he received medical treatment, food, and something far more disturbing than torture, indifference to his surrender. The Americans did not celebrate his capture. They did not mock his shame. They simply processed him as one might process paperwork, efficiently and without emotion. This, more than anything, shattered his understanding of the world. The Japanese military had spent decades constructing an ideological fortress around the concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior, adapted and weaponized for modern imperial ambition. Death before dishonor. Victory or annihilation. There existed no honorable middle ground, no acceptable third option between triumph and suicide. The Field Service Code issued to every Japanese soldier explicitly stated that capture was forbidden, that prisoners would bring eternal shame upon their families, that death in battle was the only dignified conclusion to military service. This was not merely suggestion. It was religious doctrine enforced with fanatical intensity. Officers carried ceremonial swords not just as symbols of rank but as instruments of ritual suicide. Soldiers carried grenades with instructions to use them on themselves if capture became imminent. The entire edifice of Japanese military culture was constructed on the foundation of absolute loyalty unto death. Surrender was not simply discouraged. It was literally unthinkable, a psychological impossibility reinforced through years of indoctrination. Yet here they were, 37 men who had done the unthinkable, who had crossed that forbidden threshold and now existed in a liminal space between life and death, between the world they had known and an uncertain future they could not comprehend. In the holding area, they maintained the rigid discipline of their training even in captivity. They sat in perfect rows. They did not complain about the cold or their wounds. They did not ask questions. They simply waited with the fatalistic resignation of men who believed their lives were already over, that they were merely ghosts awaiting the final dissolution. Some had attempted suicide before capture, The bandages on their throats and wrists testified to their commitment to the code. But American medics had intervened, had saved them against their will, had forced them to continue living in this state of unbearable shame. The Americans, for their part, were utterly unprepared for the psychological complexity of their Japanese prisoners. The Marines who guarded them were farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, shopkeepers' sons from Massachusetts. They had been trained to fight, to kill efficiently, to storm beaches and capture objectives. Nobody had taught them how to handle prisoners who seemed almost catatonic with shame and fear, who refused to eat, who appeared to be waiting passively for execution. The cultural gulf was immense. American soldiers could not fathom a military culture that forbade surrender, that treated capture as worse than death. In the American military tradition, surrender was acceptable when circumstances made further resistance futile. It was pragmatic, not shameful. Prisoners of war were protected by international convention, treated humanely, expected to provide name, rank, and serial number, but nothing more. The concept that these Japanese soldiers considered themselves already dead, that they expected torture and execution as their rightful due, was incomprehensible to their captors. Lieutenant Robert Hartmann, a 26-year-old intelligence officer from Chicago, was assigned to oversee the processing of Japanese prisoners on Iwo Jima. He had studied Japanese language and culture at Yale before the war, one of the relatively few American officers with any real understanding of the enemy they fought. When he first entered the holding pen on that gray February morning, he was struck by the absolute silence, the palpable tension, the sense that these men were coiled springs of barely suppressed terror. He had read the intelligence reports about Japanese attitudes toward surrender. He understood intellectually that these prisoners expected to be killed. But seeing it manifested in their posture, their expressions, their collective paralysis, was something altogether different. These were not defeated soldiers relieved that their war was over. These were men in the grip of existential crisis, caught between the survival instinct that had led them to surrender and the cultural conditioning that told them they should be dead. Hartmann began a daily routine that would, over the following weeks, fundamentally alter the psychological landscape of the prisoner camp. Each morning, he would enter the holding area and simply sit among the prisoners, saying nothing, making no demands, simply being present without hostility. He would smoke his pipe, read his mail, perform administrative tasks, treating the space as if it were merely another office rather than a prison. The Japanese prisoners watched him with wary incomprehension. This behavior did not fit any pattern they recognized. He was not cruel, but neither was he openly friendly. He simply existed in their space without apparent concern for the danger they might pose or the revenge he might rightfully claim. After several days of this routine, one of the older prisoners, a sergeant who spoke limited English, finally approached him with a question that revealed the depth of their confusion. "When will we be executed?" Hartmann looked at the sergeant with genuine surprise. "You're not going to be executed," he replied. "You're prisoners of war. You'll be held until the war ends, then repatriated to Japan." The sergeant translated this for the others. The response was not relief but deeper confusion. Several men began speaking rapidly in Japanese, their voices rising in what seemed like argument or disbelief. The sergeant turned back to Hartmann. "We have dishonored ourselves. We have dishonored the Emperor. We cannot return to Japan. We cannot face our families. It would be better to die here." This conversation would be repeated, in various forms, hundreds of times across dozens of prisoner-of-war camps throughout the Pacific Theater. The psychological chasm between American pragmatism and Japanese honor culture created a unique crisis in the Allied prisoner system. Unlike German or Italian POWs, who generally adapted quickly to captivity and often cooperated with their captors, Japanese prisoners remained locked in a state of profound psychological trauma. They could not reconcile their continued existence with their understanding of proper behavior. Suicide attempts were common. Depression was universal. Many simply refused to eat, choosing slow starvation as a form of delayed suicide acceptable within their moral framework. The American authorities, bound by Geneva Convention requirements to maintain prisoner health, found themselves in the bizarre position of force-feeding men who desperately wanted to die. But something unexpected began to happen in the weeks following that initial conversation. Hartmann, working with medical staff and guards, initiated what would later be called re-education programs, though that term carried connotations far more sinister than the reality. The approach was simple. Treat the prisoners like human beings, provide them with activities to occupy their time, and gradually demonstrate through action rather than words that the propaganda they had absorbed about American barbarism was false. Food was the first breakthrough. The prisoners had been subsisting on minimal rations for months before capture, their supply lines severed by American naval dominance. In the camps, they received 3 meals daily, not gourmet fare, but adequate nutrition including rice, vegetables, occasional meat, and luxuries like coffee and chocolate that had been unavailable to them for years. Initially, many refused to eat, viewing acceptance of American food as collaboration with the enemy. But hunger is a powerful motivator, and gradually, reluctantly, they began to accept that they would not be poisoned, that the food was genuine, that their captors actually cared whether they lived or died. Medical care provided the second revelation. American doctors treated prisoner wounds and illnesses with the same attention they provided to their own troops. Men who had suffered for weeks with infected wounds, with tropical diseases, with the cumulative trauma of months in combat, received antibiotics, surgery when necessary, pain medication, and professional nursing care. For soldiers accustomed to a military medical system where resources were scarce and suffering was considered character building, this level of care was shocking. A private named Ichiro Tanaka, captured on Saipan and later transferred to a camp in Hawaii, would write in his memoirs that an American dentist spent 2 hours repairing his broken teeth, injuries sustained during a bombardment, and refused payment, telling him through an interpreter that medical care was his right as a prisoner. Tanaka had lost 3 brothers in the war. He had fought Americans with suicidal ferocity on the beaches of Saipan. But that dentist's kindness, that casual demonstration of human decency across enemy lines, planted a seed of doubt about everything he had been taught about American demons. The transformation was not universal or immediate. Many prisoners remained locked in their shame and trauma throughout their captivity. But slowly, gradually, cracks appeared in the ideological fortress. The Americans introduced recreational activities. Baseball, volleyball, art classes, even Japanese language newspapers printed in the camps to keep prisoners informed about the war's progress. These were not propaganda sheets. They included truthful reporting about Japanese defeats, about American advances, about the reality of Japan's deteriorating strategic position. The prisoners could see that their captors did not fear the truth, did not need to construct elaborate lies about the war's progress. This transparency was itself revolutionary. In the Japanese military, information was rigidly controlled, propaganda was constant, and soldiers rarely knew the larger strategic picture. The American willingness to let prisoners read uncensored news suggested a confidence, a fundamental security in their system, that contrasted sharply with Japanese information control. But the most extraordinary breakthrough came not from food, medical care, or information, but from something far simpler: games. In the spring of 1945, at a prisoner camp on the island of Guam, a Marine guard named James Mitchell noticed several Japanese prisoners watching intently as American soldiers played checkers during their break. Mitchell was a farm kid from Montana, 20 years old, with no particular education in psychology or cultural sensitivity. He simply saw people who looked bored and decided to do something about it. He approached the wire fence, holding the checkerboard and pieces, and gestured an invitation. The prisoners recoiled initially, suspicious of this approach. But Mitchell persisted, setting up the board on his side of the fence and beginning a game with another Marine, making exaggerated moves and gestures to demonstrate the rules. The Japanese prisoners watched, their expressions revealing nothing, but they watched with absolute focus. Over the following days, Mitchell continued his demonstration. He was not trying to win hearts and minds. He was not implementing policy. He was simply killing time and perhaps, in some inchoate way, trying to treat these beaten, frightened men as something more than dangerous animals to be contained. On the fourth day, one prisoner approached the fence and, through gestures, indicated he wanted to learn. Mitchell spent an hour teaching him the basic moves. The next day, 2 more prisoners joined. Within a week, checkers had become a fixture of camp life, with games being played constantly during recreation periods. The guards noticed that prisoners who played games seemed less depressed, more engaged, more willing to communicate. The camp commander, initially skeptical of any activity that might be construed as fraternization with the enemy, observed that disciplinary problems decreased, suicide attempts stopped, and the general atmosphere shifted from hostile tension to something approaching normalcy. This pattern repeated across multiple camps throughout the Pacific. Checkers, chess, card games, and eventually more complex recreational activities became standard tools for managing Japanese POWs. But these were not merely time-killing diversions. They were profound psychological interventions, though nobody articulated them in those terms at the time. The act of playing a game with a guard, of engaging in rule-bound competition where both sides had equal opportunity to win, where the outcome depended on skill and strategy rather than rank or nationality, where losing carried no consequences beyond the game itself, introduced concepts completely alien to the Japanese military experience. In their training, everything had been hierarchical, absolute, freighted with deadly serious consequences. There was no space for play, for friendly competition, for interactions with superiors that were not structured by rigid protocol. To sit across a checkerboard from an American Marine, to compete on equal terms, to have that Marine shake his hand after winning or losing, was a revolutionary experience. Corporal Yamamoto, the young soldier from Iwo Jima, wrote extensively about this transformation in the diary he kept throughout his captivity. His entries from March 1945 are filled with confusion and shame, with repeated expressions of unworthiness to live, with a conviction that he was already a ghost unworthy of consideration. But by June, after months in the camp and regular checker games with a guard named Tommy O'Brien, his tone shifted. He wrote about learning the checker strategy called the double corner, about teaching O'Brien some Japanese words in exchange for English lessons, about the strange feeling of laughter after so many months of grimness. He wrote, "I do not understand these Americans. They should hate us. We have killed their friends. We have fought them with every weapon and tactic. Yet they treat us like, I do not have the word. Not friends, but not enemies either. Like human beings who happen to be on different sides. Is this the democracy they speak of? This idea that one's humanity transcends one's uniform." The question was more profound than Yamamoto realized. What he was experiencing, what thousands of Japanese prisoners experienced in those camps, was not merely American kindness but a fundamental difference in political philosophy. The American system, for all its flaws and contradictions, was built on Enlightenment principles that recognized individual human worth as independent of state or emperor, that conceived of rights as inherent rather than granted by authority, that believed in the possibility of redemption and change. The Japanese imperial system was constructed on opposite foundations. The individual existed to serve the state embodied the eternal and divine will of the emperor, and one's worth was measured entirely by service and sacrifice to that supreme authority. Surrender was shameful not because it was strategically unwise, but because it represented the individual's preference for life over duty, self over emperor, personal survival over collective glory. It was an assertion of individual worth against state demands, the foundational sin in the imperial system. By treating prisoners as individuals with inherent worth, by providing care and recreation and human interaction without demanding ideological conversion or public denunciations of their former allegiance, the Americans were making a philosophical argument more powerful than any propaganda speech. They were demonstrating that a system could be powerful without being totalitarian, that soldiers could be fierce in battle yet humane in victory, that one's enemy in war was not necessarily one's enemy in humanity. This was not intentional policy crafted by brilliant strategists in Washington. It emerged organically from American cultural values, from the democratic tradition that, however imperfectly realized, had shaped the worldview of farm boys and factory workers who became guards and administrators in POW camps. They treated prisoners decently not because they were following sophisticated psychological warfare doctrine, but because their culture had taught them that this was the baseline of acceptable behavior. The symbolic power of the checkerboard itself deserves examination. Here was a game with ancient origins, played across cultures for millennia, embodying principles of equality, strategy, and bounded competition. The board itself was a perfect democracy. Identical pieces, mirror image starting positions, turn-based play ensuring equal opportunity. Victory came through superior strategy, not superior force or predetermined hierarchy. The game could be reset and replayed infinitely. Losing one game did not determine one's identity or worth. These principles, embedded in the structure of the game itself, enacted in every session played between guard and prisoner, communicated truths about democratic systems more effectively than any lecture or pamphlet. The checker piece, simple, interchangeable, yet capable of strategic importance and even transformation, when kinged, became a symbol of individual agency within an egalitarian system. Every prisoner who learned to play internalized these principles, perhaps unconsciously, certainly without formal instruction. Lieutenant Hartmann, observing this phenomenon across the camps under his supervision, wrote a lengthy report to his superiors in July 1945, arguing that recreational programs represented the most effective method for managing Japanese POWs and reducing the security risks posed by men who considered themselves dead and therefore capable of suicidal violence. His report was filed and largely forgotten in the chaos of the war's final months, but it documented a remarkable transformation. Prisoners who engaged in games and recreational activities showed dramatically lower rates of depression, suicide attempts, and violent resistance. They were more willing to cooperate with camp administration, more likely to provide useful intelligence information, and more receptive to truthful information about the war's progress. The camps that implemented extensive recreational programs had better health outcomes, fewer disciplinary problems, and lower costs per prisoner than camps that maintained a purely custodial approach. From a purely utilitarian perspective, treating prisoners like human beings was more efficient than treating them like dangerous cargo. But efficiency was not the point. The point, understood only dimly by most participants at the time, was that the experience of captivity under American administration was shattering the ideological foundations of Japanese militarism in ways that battlefield defeats could not. You could lose a war and maintain your belief system intact. Indeed, many totalitarian movements have thrived on narratives of noble defeat and future resurgence. But when your belief system tells you that your enemies are barbaric demons, and you then experience them as fundamentally decent humans who treat you better than your own officers did, the cognitive dissonance becomes unbearable. The choice is to either maintain the ideology and descend into madness, or to revise your understanding of the world. Thousands of Japanese prisoners chose revision. They did not become American patriots or denounce the emperor. That would have been a psychological impossibility, a betrayal too great to contemplate. But they began to question the specific teachings of military indoctrination. They began to wonder whether their commanders had lied to them about other things. They began to imagine that perhaps surrender had not made them monsters, that perhaps their humanity persisted despite their dishonor. As the summer of 1945 progressed and Japan's strategic situation deteriorated into hopelessness, the psychological importance of POW treatment took on new dimensions. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, followed by the emperor's unprecedented radio address announcing surrender, created a surreal moment in the camps. The prisoners learned that their entire nation had done what they had done, had surrendered, had chosen survival over annihilation. The shame that had isolated them was now collective, national, shared by every Japanese person, including the emperor himself. This was simultaneously devastating and liberating. If the emperor could surrender, if the divine will could bend before necessity, then perhaps individual surrender was not the unforgivable sin they had believed. The prisoners who had spent months learning to play checkers, to laugh occasionally, to see their American captors as humans rather than demons, were psychologically better prepared for this moment than their compatriots still fighting in the jungles of the Philippines or the ruins of Japanese cities. In the months following Japan's surrender, as prisoners were processed for repatriation, American authorities conducted extensive interviews to assess attitudes and gather intelligence about conditions in Japan. These interviews revealed the profound impact of POW experiences. Former prisoners spoke about the abundance they had witnessed in American camps, not luxury, but simple adequacy, the baseline expectation that human needs would be met. They spoke about medical care, about guards who learned their names, about the bewildering experience of being treated as individuals with rights. Many expressed terror about returning to Japan, fear about how they would be received, whether their families would accept them after their dishonor. But many also expressed hope that the Japan they returned to would be different, that perhaps the lessons they had learned about different ways of organizing society might take root in the ruins of empire. The subsequent American occupation of Japan would draw, consciously and unconsciously, on these lessons. General Douglas MacArthur's administration implemented democratic reforms with unprecedented speed and depth, transforming Japan's political structure, education system, and cultural institutions. The occupation succeeded in ways that still seem almost miraculous, a defeated, traumatized nation accepting radical transformation from its conqueror and emerging as a stable democracy and economic powerhouse. This success had many causes. MacArthur's shrewd decision to retain the emperor as a symbolic figure, Japan's sophisticated pre-war civil society, the external threat posed by Soviet expansion, American economic aid, and Japan's own cultural capacity for pragmatic adaptation. But among these factors, surely the POW experience played a role. Thousands of former prisoners returned to Japan with first-hand knowledge that Americans were not demons, that democratic systems could function effectively, that alternatives to militarism existed. They became quiet evangelists for change, not through propaganda but through personal testimony about their treatment in captivity. Corporal Yamamoto returned to his village outside Osaka in December 1945. His family had believed him dead, had held a funeral in his honor, had erected a memorial tablet in the household shrine. His sudden reappearance alive, bearing the shame of survival and captivity, was initially traumatic for everyone. His father, a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War, could not look at him for days. His mother wept but seemed confused by her own grief and joy. His younger brother treated him like a ghost. But Yamamoto persevered, gradually telling his story, describing the camps, the treatment, the strange Americans who had taught him to play checkers and treated his wounds. He found work as a clerk, married a local girl whose fiancé had died at Okinawa, and raised 3 children in the democratic Japan that emerged from the ruins. In an oral history interview conducted in 1983, 4 years before his death, he reflected on his wartime experiences. "I learned 2 lessons as a prisoner. First, that I wanted to live, even in shame, because life itself has value independent of honor or duty. Second, that the Americans, for all their military power, were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They wanted to win, but they did not want to destroy us. They believed we could change, could become something different. They were right. That belief in the possibility of change, in human malleability, in the power of institutions and culture to shape behavior for better or worse, This was perhaps the most fundamental divide between the warring systems. The Japanese imperial ideology was essentially static, rooted in eternal verities about racial destiny and divine mission. The American democratic tradition was dynamic, rooted in the Enlightenment faith that humans could improve, societies could reform, and that progress was possible through reason and institutional design. The POW camps became laboratories for this philosophical debate, spaces where the collision of these worldviews played out not in abstract political theory but in concrete human interactions. The checkerboard, that simple grid of 64 squares, became an arena where different conceptions of human nature and social organization competed. And the prisoners who learned to play, who experienced equal competition and friendly rivalry with their former enemies, became converts not to American nationalism but to the deeper principles that American democracy, at its best, represented. The epilogue to this story extends across decades. Many former Japanese POWs maintained correspondence with American guards long after the war, exchanging Christmas cards and occasionally visiting. The checker sets themselves, those simple wooden boards with red and black pieces, were preserved by some prisoners as sacred objects, symbols of their transformation from doomed ghosts into living men. Several found their way into Japanese museums dedicated to the war, displayed alongside uniforms and weapons as artifacts not of combat but of a different kind of victory, the victory of humane values over ideological rigidity, of individual recognition over collectivist abstraction, of the stubborn insistence that even enemies remain fundamentally human. In the great accounting of World War II's costs and lessons, the story of Japanese prisoners learning to play checkers seems almost absurdly minor, a footnote to the massive campaigns and strategic turning points that determined nations' fates. But perhaps it is in such small moments, in such intimate human interactions, that the deepest truths about political systems and human nature are revealed. Freedom, it turns out, is not merely the absence of oppression but the presence of possibility, the possibility to change, to err and survive, to forfeit honor yet retain humanity, to sit across a checkerboard from your enemy and find not a demon but another young man far from home, equally caught in history's currents, equally human in his hopes and fears. The Japanese soldiers who learned this lesson in American captivity became witnesses to a larger truth, that systems built on recognizing human dignity, on treating individuals as ends rather than means, on the democratic faith that ordinary people possess inherent worth and capacity for self-governance, are not merely more moral but ultimately more durable than systems built on hierarchy, mythology, and coercion. The checker pieces moved across their squares in those Pacific camps, kings and commons advancing and retreating in eternal patterns, and in those movements lived the entire argument for democratic civilization against totalitarian alternatives. It was a small thing, teaching checkers to prisoners. It was also everything.